I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Joseph Smith's plans for the Mormons and for America at large, let's just say they were quite grand. He had a lot in store for the world if he could carry out his plans to fruition and show the world that a better version of itself awaited should it trust him as its supreme temporal leader and Elohim as its supreme spiritual leader. How do you build a kingdom? I mean, you basically have to buy it if you're averse to bloodshed, which Joe kind of was. And for this reason, money was always in a shortage. Now, this is one of those bedrock issues that we talk about relatively frequently on the show, kind of like polygamy or power struggles or dissent among trusted elites, and a few other kind of fundamental issues which seem to influence nearly everything that happens in Nauvoo Mormonism. But my point is, desperation fueled these desperate money ploys. The primary income for building the Nauvoo Empire was tithing donations, but those can be quite unreliable, especially as more Mormons giving more money to the church resulted in an overall more destitute population. Beyond that, those who had more tended to give more. Those folks became frequent targets of the leadership to extort as much as possible from them. But if you're a rich guy and the prophet or apostles come knocking a couple of times a month asking for money, it gets old pretty quickly, and the promises become more grand and less fulfilled. At the end of the day, Nauvoo in 1844 was a big city, but it still had a little town charm. It had grown from a small, homogeneous group of people into a relatively large metropolis, but it still retained many of the trappings of a small town. Everybody talked to everybody about everybody else's business. People saw their neighbors every day, and that small town drama pervaded the culture, especially because those in authority in Nauvoo were also the same figures in ecclesiastical authority. In normal small towns, you have the pastor to gossip about, and then you have the city council and mayor with their own set of gossip. In Nauvoo, however, those were the same people who were the subjects of town gossip. People were constantly nosing into other people's business as a form of entertainment before radio and television became centers of attention. And the thing with a small town is, it's also really challenging to hide one's business. If a farmer has a herd of cattle on the outskirts of town, then they go on a cattle drive to sell off a portion of the herd. Everybody in town saw that the herd was decimated after the person's return, and everybody knew this guy was walking around town with some money in his pockets. A wandering trader might come into town with some rare or desirable items and then stay for a few days and then leave town without carrying those items. And it wasn't long before all the Nauvoo townsfolk knew that somebody in town had just traded a sum of money for that desirable or rare thing. Maybe that person kept that thing in a trunk at the foot of their bed. Maybe they carried it on their person. Is the item in a place which isn't well guarded? How did they get the money to buy that item in the first place? Do they have more money laying around unguarded somewhere in their house? Not only did this gossip, this small town gossip, pervade everyday interactions of many citizens of Nauvoo, but Joe had his little birdies in every dark alley of the city funneling information back to him. Nothing escaped his notice. Perception was a skill that he had curried in his early days of New York treasure digging and occult practices, and it served him well in building his religious empire. When somebody in Nauvoo had some money, he knew about it, and the gear cogs of the cycle of religious extortion would lurch into motion. I offer as an example of this a Mr. Orm. Mr. Orm was a Mormon and apparently quite wealthy. It seems he'd answered the door to the apostles asking for money quite a few times, and he was sick of unfulfilled promises. Instead of going himself, Joe sent a couple of trusted thugs to Orm's house to get some of that piggy bank that he'd been hiding away for some time. Quoting from the History of the Church, Dan Vogel edition, Volume 6, quote, "Being in a strait to raise money to assist the hands in the Pine Country, I sent Elders Brigham Young and Willard Richards to borrow some money of Mr. Orm, who, it is believed, had a large sum of money lying idle, but did not get any." End quote. The Mormon leadership was always in a strait to raise money, whether that was for a specific project like Lyman White's Pinery mission, or for the general operating costs of the church and its functionaries. The apostles simply didn't carry as much clout as the prophet himself. Mr. Orm's refusal to give up any of his money can be readily juxtaposed with Joe personally approaching a Mr. John Wilkie the previous day. Joe went to Wilkie's house and asked for some of the money that the guy had been hoarding. And once again, from the Dan Vogel History of the Church, Volume 6, this is on page 293, quote, "Went to see Brother John Wilkie. He had sent to me to come and see him. He wanted to know what he should do. I told him of the order of tithing, etc., and he wanted I should come again." End quote. The next day, Joe did just that and had the exchange recorded in the Book of the Law of the Lord. We'll discuss what that is in a minute, but this is how it was recorded. Quote, "This day, President Joseph rode over to Brother John Wilkie's at his special request to give him some instructions relative to his duty in regard to tithing and consecration. Brother Wilkie has for a long time back been struggling with his feelings, designing to do right, but laboring under many fears and prejudices in consequence of having in some degree given way to believe the base reports circulated by individuals for the purpose of injuring the authorities of the church and also from other various causes. His faithful companion has persevered diligently and with fervent prayer has called upon God in his behalf until she has realized her utmost wishes. Brother Wilkie now feels anxious to do right in all things, and especially to pay his tithing to the full. President Joseph showed him the principles of consecration and the means whereby he might realize the fullness of the blessings of the celestial kingdom. And as an evidence that he desired to do right, he paid over to the trustee in trust, that's Joseph Smith, the sum of $300 in gold and silver for the benefit of the temple, and which is now recorded on consecration. And it has the amount $300.28. It continues. He also signified his intention of paying more as soon as he could get matters properly arranged. The president then pronounced a blessing upon him and his companion, that they should have the blessing of God to attend them in their basket and in their store, that they should have the blessing of health and salvation and long life, inasmuch as they would continue to walk in obedience to the commandments of God. May the Lord grant his spirit and peace to abide upon Brother Wilkie and his companion through the remainder of their days. May their hearts expand and become enlarged to receive the fullness of the blessings of the kingdom of heaven. May they have the light of eternal truth continually springing up in them like a well of living water. May they be shielded from the powers of Satan and the influence of designing men, and their faith increase from day to day until they shall have power to lay hold on the blessings of God and the gifts of the Spirit, until they are satisfied. And finally, may they live to a good old age. And when they have lived while they desire life, may they die in peace, and be received into the mansions of eternal life, and enjoy a celestial glory forever and ever. Even so, amen." End quote. That's how Brother John Wilkie's donation was recorded on page 449 of the Book of the Law of the Lord. Let's discuss the contents of that passage and then discuss what it means to have a person's name and contribution included in the Book of the Law of the Lord. And we'll discuss the book itself as, well, let's just say extensively for this episode. First, the content of John Wilkie's questions, Joe's instructions, and then Joe's blessings upon the Wilkies after the contribution was made. Now, it talks about the law of tithing, but then it also refers to consecration. The law of consecration, as it was used in Kirtland, could be used as a euphemism here during the Nauvoo era. Consecration in Kirtland was the act of dedicating all of one's property to the bishop's storehouse to be controlled by the United Order, the church's communalistic property controlling entity. The law of consecration was how Joe was able to vacuum up all of the Mormon leadership-owned businesses in Kirtland and use their income for his own personal gain. This worked until it didn't, and he ran most of the businesses into the ground. However, in Nauvoo, the law of consecration was utilized more broadly. Tithing at the time meant dedicating 1 in every 10 days to the mission of the church. That usually meant building the temple. If a person was unable to donate time, then they had to tithe the resources like livestock or property or money. The law of tithing was essentially a mechanism built into the law of consecration of dedicating one's time, talents, or possessions to the church. However, because this was the rampant polygamy era of Nauvoo Mormonism, consecration could also refer to John's wife. Now, this is a complicated issue to tease out, and the record as we read it from the Book of the Law of the Lord is just ambiguous enough that it could mean quite a few things. But first, John Wilkie was apparently apprehensive of donating to the church because of the rumors about the leadership the designing men had been propagating, right? That means polygamy, right? Where it says, but Wilkie, laboring under many fears and prejudices in consequence of having in some degree given way to believing the base reports of polygamy circulated by individuals for the purpose of injuring the authorities of the church, that means that he was believing that the rumors of polygamy were true. Now, what immediately follows that passage is quite interesting. Quote, his faithful companion has persevered diligently and with fervent prayer has called upon God in his behalf until she has realized her utmost wishes, end quote. What could that mean? It's just ambiguous enough, but what does that mean? Was she operating under the law of Sarah within the polygamy revelation and received her spiritual confirmation that she had to accept of any woman that John brings home to be his second wife, or she would be damned? Was she wanting a sister wife for some reason, and both her and John had picked a candidate that they could both agree on? Was it her or John who was the instigator of their coming plural marriage? I mean, like I said, the entry is just ambiguous enough, and the term consecration had broadened just enough that we can read a fair amount from that passage. And in many ways, like polygamy is almost always perceived as a reward system for the men because that's how it was initially conceived. But it should also be noted that there were plenty of reasons for women to benefit from it in different ways beyond practicing it because it was a requirement for salvation and to enjoy the fullness of the blessings of the celestial kingdom. So what I mean by that, and this is treating polygamy as a separate issue from everything that we typically understand as the salacious aspects of trafficking and very misogynistic, problematic issues with polygyny. This is a separate issue. Let's face it, this is the Victorian era of repressed sexuality. So my point that I'm making here as a side issue of polygamy is, for lesbians, polygamy was about the best available option to them. Now, I don't mean to be crass or to sound insensitive here, but please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. In many plural marriages, primarily in Utah, but a bit in Nauvoo, wives had a say in who their sister wife would be. The more sister wives they had, the less time they're forced to spend with the husband that they probably don't love, and the more time they spend with a partner that oftentimes they had some sway in choosing. For a society that repressed women and sexual expression outside of cis-hetero marriages, polygamy opened up a world of possibilities for women that they otherwise could never access. So when I say that line about John Wilkie's companion calling upon God until, quote, she has realized her utmost wishes, end quote, could mean anything, it really could mean anything under this term of consecration. But it could also mean the more salacious and much more likely interpretation that she was going to be given as a wife to a church leader. That's probably a more reasonable interpretation of it. Anyway, once John Wilkie coughed up the $300.28, the promises and blessings flowed from the prophet as long as the Wilkies, quote, continued to walk in obedience to the commandments of God. And those blessings that they would get, may their hearts expand and become enlarged, the light of eternal truth continually springing up like them, and like a well of living water. They'd be shielded from the powers of Satan and the influence of designing men, and their faith would increase from day to day until they shall have power to lay hold on the blessings of God and the gifts of the Spirit, end quote. I mean, this contribution and Joe's many blessings on the Wilkies, that was all recorded in the book of the law of the Lord, which is actually the primary focus of our episode today, and thus the title, the Book of the Law of the Lord, or the BoLoL. What does that mean, the Book of the Law of the Lord? So let's take this opportunity to do a deep dive into the Book of the Law of the Lord. First, the contents. The BoLoL was created in 1841, and you can see pictures of it. It is a beautiful ledger book that was initially acquired by Robert B. Thompson while he was Joe's scribe. Now, our examination of the Book of the Law of the Lord, the BoLoL, will be broken up into three parts today. First, the content, second, the purpose, and third, the controversy. So the BoLoL, as I like to call it, was broken up into three separate parts. It starts out, beginning on page 1, with 9 of Joseph Smith's revelations. These revelations are the smash hits of Joe's revelations, the billboard list of Joe's theocracy-building words of God. Now, the content and context of each of these revelations bears individual examination because it sets the scene for the purpose of the BoLoL, which we'll discuss after we kind of cover the actual contents. So the first of these included 9 revelations at the beginning of the BoLoL, was Joe's first official Nauvoo revelation in Modern Doctrine and Covenants section 124. This is the longest of Joe's revelations, and it essentially establishes the city of Nauvoo as the kingdom of God, a sovereign theocracy within the boundaries of the United States. It is truly one of Joe's most important and iconic revelations, and it's the very first written words inside this book, setting the tone for the theocratic purpose of the book in general. Of course, if you want to learn all about DNC 124, Maria and I read through it on episodes, let me get this right, episodes 197 through 202 on the My Book of Mormon podcast, where we invited on special guests, of course, to help us go through Nauvoo Mormon history. But essentially, this is the most important revelation of Joseph Smith's Nauvoo era, DNC 124. And, like I said, it does, set the tone for the theocratic purpose of the book. And the next revelation that's included after that is a revelation specific about specific people carrying out specific Nauvoo kingdom building operations dealing with the Nauvoo house and what consecrating property means. The revelation following that is Modern Day Doctrine and Covenants section 125, which tells the saints in the Iowa territory what to do, which is essentially more kingdom building stuff when they named the Mormon headquarters in Iowa Zarahemla. The project of building a Mormon settlement in Iowa as basically a twin city to Nauvoo right across the Mississippi River, that was quickly defunded, and the resources were instead devoted to the Nauvoo Temple and the Nauvoo House Hotel projects. The included revelation after that revelation is really interesting because it progresses further back in time to a rough period of Mormon history. Now, that revelation that we're talking about now was an unpublished revelation dated in January of 1838. And that revelation essentially adjudicated the power of a previous revelation. That previous revelation is not included in the book of the Law of the Lord, but the revelation that the one that's included in the Law of the Lord is adjudicating an 1835 edition Doctrine and Covenants section 3, verse 37. So let's read briefly from that. It's titled On Priesthood, and verse 37 reads, quote, "And inasmuch as a president of the high priesthood shall transgress, he shall be had in remembrance before the common council of the church, who shall be assisted by 12 counselors of the high priesthood, and their decisions upon his head shall be an end of controversy concerning him. Thus none shall be exempted from the justice and the laws of God, and all things may be done in order and in solemnity before him according to truth and righteousness." End quote. So that's DNC, the 1835 DNC section 3, verse 37, titled On Priesthood. So the revelation that's included in the book of the Law of the Lord basically adjudicates the power of that verse. And what that really is, what that verse 37 really is a mechanism that Joe built into his revelations for checking the power of the leadership. If the presidency of the high priesthood, meaning Joe and his counselors, does something, this verse 37 governs the presidency's impeachment and the tribunal process required in order to remove them from the presidency of the church. Now, the unpublished revelation that's included in the BoLoL, the Book of the Law of the Lord, provides interesting context as the leadership was attempting to determine the powers that this verse provides and how far it extends. Now, why is this relevant? There's a little background on why this was included and why the unpublished revelation in the BoLoL is important in and of itself. In January of 1838, when Joe gave this revelation adjudicating the 1835 section 3, verse 37, the Kirtland Church was melting down. The Fanny Alger incident had just occurred, and the hearings were held to determine if this was adultery and if Joe was to be removed or impeached for that charge of adultery. The Kirtland Safety Society had failed, and hundreds of Mormons had lost thousands of dollars as a result. The Missouri stake of the church was being run by Oliver Cowdery, D.D. David Wimmer, and John Goebbels Whitmer, who were all three pretty opposed to the way that Joe was running things. The Quorum of the Twelve's power was continuing to grow under Bloody Brigham Young's presidency. Hingepin Sidney Rigdon was Joe's partner in crime through all of this. Legal issues were a constant weight on the leadership as Joe and Rigdon owed tens of thousands of dollars to creditors throughout the country. And a court ruling had just handed the 3-story printing and school building that existed behind the temple into the hands of non-Mormon creditors for unpaid debts. Also, Martin Harris had just stood up during Sunday worship service in the temple and said that he had only seen the gold plates with his spiritual eyes. In addition to all of that, and probably as a result of Martin Harris saying then, the Parishite faction of the Mormons, led by Warren Parrish, had just stormed a Sunday meeting with pistols and bowie knives to literally wrestle power out of Joe's hands, which led to multiple legal complaints and arrests. 1838 was a tough time for Joe's leadership, so they held a tribunal to determine if he was going to be impeached for adultery. The result of the tribunal determined if Joe was in error. They sided with him instead of with the will of the people. Joe had successfully gotten away with his crimes and remained president of the church. As a result, a faction of the church organically formed to oppose Joe, and they determined to excommunicate him, leaving the Kirtland Temple in their hands. Joe, Rigdon, and the Quorum of the Apostles were forced to flee in shame under the cover of night because of this tribunal. Now, this is all stuff that we covered in episodes 19 to 41 of the show, so if you want a really long refresher on everything that I just listed, go back. So back to the BoLoL, right? So this unpublished revelation included in the 9 revelations at the beginning of the BoLoL was given while Joe was on the run on January 12th, 1838 as a result of everything here. He was hiding out with some of the 12 on a farm near Kirtland before they crossed the state toward the Missouri church. They asked Joe if the ruling of that tribunal siding with Joe was binding on all the stakes of the church or if it just existed for only the Kirtland stake. They needed that revelation in hand when they got to Missouri, so the Missouri stake leadership, Cowdery and the Whitmers, couldn't hold their own tribunal and excommunicate Joe when he got there. So the functional provision in this unpublished revelation given in 1838 while Joe was in hiding as a result of all of the Kirtland church melting down, it reads as follows, quote, "Thus saith the Lord, let the first presidency of my church be held in full fellowship in Zion," that's Missouri, "and in all her stakes, until they shall be found transgressors by such a high council as is named in the above alluded section, in Zion, by 3 witnesses standing against each member of said presidency. And these witnesses shall be of long and faithful standing, and such also as cannot be impeached by other witnesses before such council, and when a decision is had by such a council in Zion, it shall only be for Zion. It shall not answer for her stakes. But if such a decision be acknowledged by the council of her stakes, then it shall answer for her stakes. But if it is not acknowledged by the stakes, then such stake may have the privilege of learning for themselves, or if such decision be acknowledged by a majority of the stakes, then it shall answer for all her stakes." So, end quote. All right, that's a bunch of gobbledygook, right? But in summary, this unpublished BoLoL revelation states that the judgment of the Kirtland stake doesn't hold for the Zion stake, meaning the Missouri stake of the church, unless the Zion stake agrees to the ruling of the Kirtland stake. So, when Joe got to Missouri with this revelation in hand after he had essentially been functionally excommunicated from the Kirtland stake, the Missouri stake wanted to have their own tribunal to excommunicate Joe. So instead, he excommunicated the Whitmers, Cowdery, and William Wines Double Dub Phelps, and issued the Danite Manifesto, giving all of these guys 3 days to leave town or they would suffer the consequences. This all was a hell of a power grab, and it was a result of this unpublished revelation, and it worked. The reason this unpublished revelation was included was to put in place the impeachment powers for the theocratic Mormon kingdom that the BoLoL was created to establish, the book of the law of the Lord. And we'll discuss that further once we get through the contents and we get into a bit more of the purpose of the book into section 2 of the episode. The next revelation that's included in the list of the 9 opening revelations in the BoLoL was another unpublished revelation, further adjudicating the powers of the first presidency and what constitutes a stake. It says, quote, "Thus saith the Lord, verily I say unto you, nay, no stake shall be appointed except by the first presidency, and this presidency be acknowledged by the voice of the same, otherwise it shall not be counted as a stake in Zion. And again, except it be dedicated by this presidency, it cannot be acknowledged as a stake of Zion. For unto this end have I appointed them in laying the foundation of and establishing my kingdom. Even so, amen." End quote. Therefore, the stake that was established by the Kirtland defectors who kicked Joe and the first presidency and the Quorum of 12 out of Kirtland, this unpublished revelation ruled that to not be an officially recognized stake by the will and power of God, by the first presidency, right? This also granted powers to the first presidency, claiming the BoLoL as a constitution to be the ruling body of the church. If the first presidency didn't recognize a stake or they chose to withdraw their recognition of a stake, then that stake held no power or sway with the leadership of the church. So they could just withdraw their recognition of the Kirtland stake as an official stake of the church, and whatever the Kirtland stake had to say, even though that stake had the temple in their possession, it had absolutely no bearing on the actual leadership under Joseph Smith's control, right? So the previously unpublished revelation established the power play. This unpublished revelation insulated that power play from being questioned or nullified by a competing stake leadership. Now, the next included revelation in the BoLoL, the first 9 revelations of the BoLoL, is the Fishing River revelation that was given at the conclusion of Zion's Camp, which was the first military expedition of Joseph Smith in 1834, which was created in response to the Mormons being kicked out of Jackson County, Missouri in 1833. We discussed Zion's Camp with David Michael back on episodes 30 and 31 of the show, if you want to go back and listen. But this whole thing, Zion's Camp, it was a disaster, but I suspect the reason the Fishing River revelation was included at the beginning of the BoLoL is because of this passage. Quote, "Zion cannot be built up unless it is by the principles of the law of the celestial kingdom. Otherwise, I cannot receive her unto myself, and my people must needs be chastened until they learn obedience, if it must needs be by the things which they suffer." End quote. That is quite an interesting revelation to include in this. By the principles of the law of the celestial kingdom. And I would argue that the BoLoL itself is what is setting up the laws of the celestial kingdom, the book of the law of the Lord. The BoLoL also includes the revelation that Joe gave during his treasure digging trip to Salem, Massachusetts back in August of 1836. And it states in part, quote, "And it shall come to pass in due time that I will give this city," Salem, Massachusetts, "into your hands, and you shall have power over it, insomuch that they shall not discover your secret parts, and its wealth pertaining to gold and silver shall be yours." End quote. Salem, Massachusetts was an important and historical city in New England. This revelation was obviously quite important to include into the introductory revelations on inside the beginning of the BoLoL, right? The next included revelation is super interesting because it is Modern Doctrine and Covenants, section 87. This is the revelation that Joe gave about the American rebellion taking place in South Carolina and the slaves rising up to overthrow the government. The revelation states in part, quote, "And it shall come to pass, after many days, slaves shall rise up against their masters, who shall be disciplined for war. And it shall come to pass that the remnant who are left of the land will marshal themselves," that's the remnant that are left of the land, that's the Native Americans, "will marshal themselves, and shall become exceeding angry, and shall vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation." End quote. This revelation, D&C 87 and modern D&C 87, this revelation being printed in the original book of Joe's Revelations, the Book of Commandments, that catalyzed the first Missouri uprising against the Mormons in 1833, where the Missourians in Jackson County literally burned down the printing press, whipped, tarred and feathered, stabbed, and shot a small number of the Mormon leadership. For slave states like Missouri, this revelation was either a harbinger of a coming slave revolution or a direct declaration of war by abolitionist New Englanders against Southern Democrats that were the majority of Missouri. Now, if we could boil issues down to brass tacks here, this revelation alone catalyzed Zion's camp, the exodus from Kirtland to Missouri. It also catalyzed the Missouri Mormon War and the leadership internment in Liberty Jail and the third mass exodus to the state of Illinois and Iowa Territory and so many other terrible events in Mormon history. This one revelation alone was responsible for so much Mormon suffering, including the Hansmill Massacre. However, because the wording is so strong and it is a legitimate prophecy and it captured the true intent of the Mormon theocratic empire, it should be no wonder it was included in the introductory revelations to the book of the Law of the Lord. And now, finally, the last of the 9 included revelations at the introduction of the BoLoL was Joe's response to the intel of the Missourians' violent treatment of the Mormons in Jackson County. This revelation, when taken in context of all of the previously included revelations, all 8 of them before, this one is an actual declaration of war against the United States. This is included as modern-day Doctrine and Covenants section 103, and the relevant passages are as follows, quote, "Verily I say unto you, my friends, behold, I will give unto you a revelation and commandment, that you may know how to act in the discharge of your duties concerning the salvation and redemption of your brethren, who have been scattered on the land of Zion, being driven and smitten by the hands of mine enemies, on whom I will pour out my wrath without mercy." Mercy is stricken through, and it says measure. So who knows what the initial intent of that was? But this is God speaking through Joseph Smith. "On whom, the Missourians, I will pour out my wrath without measure in mine own time. But verily I say unto you, I have decreed a decree which my people shall realize, inasmuch as they hearken from this very hour unto the counsel which I, the Lord their God, shall give unto them. Behold, they shall, for I have decreed it, begin to prevail against mine enemies from this very hour. And by hearkening to observe all the words which I, the Lord their God, shall speak unto them, they never cease to prevail until the kingdoms of the world are subdued under my feet, and the earth is again given unto the saints to possess it forever and ever." End quote. That is remarkable. That is the book of the Law of the Lord, the introduction to the book of the Law of the Lord is those 9 revelations. And when read in totality, in context, it is the law of the Lord being established, declarations of war against the enemies of the church, those who oppose the construction of the Mormon theocracy, those who don't want to see the world given over to a Mormon revolution. All 9 of these revelations are truly incredible when read together. What follows these 9 revelations in the BoLoL, the book of the Law of the Lord, is part 2 of the BoLoL. Now, part 2 comprises a chunk of Joe's journal entries, covering the entire year of 1842, written in the hands of Whiteout Willard Richards, Erastus Derby, Eliza R. Snow, and William Clayton, or Quilliam Claypen, as we call him. Now, 1842 was a super important and busy year for Joseph Smith's history because it included the translation and publication of the Book of Mormon, the introduction of the endowment ceremony, Joe's ascendancy to Master Mason, the formation of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, the Lilburn W. Boggs assassination attempt debacle, the sharp and public removal of John C. Reckitt Bennett from church leadership, as well as the orchestration of the campaign to discredit the allegations made in his expose, Joe's arrest in Dixon, Illinois, and the resulting near extradition to Missouri to answer for his crimes during the 1838 Missouri Mormon War, the introduction of the Anointed Quorum, and half a dozen other major issues of massive consequence. 1842 may be the best accounted for year in the life of Joseph Smith's entire ministry because Joe, at this time, had a scribe by his side constantly detailing the events of his everyday life. It's also interesting to see the transition from one scribe to the next scribe. And why I say that is when you actually look at the Book of the Law of the Lord, the majority of Whiteout Willard Richards' journal entries in this part 2 of the BoLoL are like 1 or 2 lines. But once Quilliam Claypen takes over the scribal duties for Whiteout Willard Richards, many entries span an entire page or more detailing the events of that day. Some of them include pages and pages of letters that are copied documenting Joe's correspondence with church leaders or with political figures or with creditors or with all sorts of people. You see, the BoLoL is one of the greatest resources historians have for Joseph Smith's life because part 2 here is such a detailed account of his daily activities. So the BoLoL is broken up into these 3 pieces, essentially. Piece 1 has the 9 revelations at the beginning. Piece 2 is Joseph Smith's 1842 journal. And now part 3. Part 3 of the BoLoL includes over 400 pages of donation records to the church from November 1841 through May of 1844, just a month prior to Joseph Smith's death, just like the one that we read about John Wilkie and his companion at the beginning of the episode. So that's a super simplistic breakdown of the 3 parts of the BoLoL. I say simplistic because the divisions aren't actually this simple. So the last over 400 pages are accounting records for donations, but the book isn't broken perfectly with like Revelations as part 1, then Joe's Journal as part 2, and then the donations as part 3. Because the donations seem to have taken precedent from pages 27 to 477, while the journal entries seem to kind of be filled in the line breaks between the donation pages. So in order to better illustrate my point here, I'm going to read a brief excerpt from an article that we're going to be discussing a little bit in a minute here. This article is written by Alex D. Smith, and it was published in the Journal of Mormon History in 2012. Alex Smith was one of the guys working on the Joseph Smith Papers project when they published the full scans and transcript of the BoLoL, which we're going to get into in part 3 here. And this is what Alex Smith says about the breakdown of the donations and the journal entries. And of course, you'll find a link to his article from the Journal of Mormon History in 2012 in the show notes. Quote, "These earliest entries in the book may be more appropriately termed historical entries rather than journal entries, as apparently the record was not immediately viewed as a journal for Joseph Smith. A number of headings in the early journal entry portion of the book indicate a developing conception of the book's purpose." End quote. So then Alex Smith goes on to describe basically the structure of these entries that he labels as historical instead of like a journal where they seem to be topically listed regarding prophecy or a meeting about a coal mine or a visit from various people selling land to Joseph Smith, instead of like this day, January 14th, 1842, and then lists what happens. So then he goes on to write this, quote, "Then, finally, on page 58, 32 pages after the entries begin, the heading appears, Journal of President Joseph. Additionally, the first few months of entries are not always in chronological order, and occasionally entries bear the same date as earlier entries. For instance, the month of January 1842 contains several instances of multiple entries with the same date but different content. The journal entries and donations are kept concurrently, sometimes alternating every other page until page 215. The concurrent and interspersed journal entries and donations evince a unifying purpose or, at the very least, a common function of the recorder's responsibilities. The alternating donations and entries, with their contemporaneous dates and the degree to which they are interspersed, suggest that they were kept at the same time. On occasion, either the donations or journals were recorded for some time, with the other added in when time permitted. For instance, one sentence in the August 16, 1842 is divided mid-sentence by 28 pages of donations, an indication that space left between the donations was being used to record journal entries. At times, the journal entries and surrounding donations are concretely related, with one elucidating the other." End quote. So, the content of this book it's not so simply broken up into parts 1, 2, and 3. Part 1, the 9 revelations, that's very clear and distinct. But then parts 2 and 3 being Joseph Smith's 1842 journal and the donations of 1841 through 1844, they're kind of interspersed with each other, at least for about the first 100 pages of the book. And that does it for the contents, and that does it for part 1 of our discussion about the BoLoL. That's the content of this book. So let's discuss the second issue that we're going to focus on today, the purpose of the BoLoL. Why was this thing created? Alex Smith's Journal of Mormon History article provides an interesting window into what he sees as the purpose of the BoLoL, the book of the law of the Lord. First, keeping it as a record was consistent with prior revelation. You see, Joe had given a revelation in the form of a letter to William Wines Double Dub Phelps all the way back in 1832, only 2 years into his ministry, that, quote, "It is the duty of the Lord's clerk whom he has appointed to keep a history and a general church record of all things that transpire in Zion, and of all those who consecrate properties, and also their manner of life, and the faith and works, and also of all the apostates who apostatize after receiving their inheritances," end quote. That portion was later included as part of the modern Doctrine and Covenants section 85. Alex Smith's article speculates that the book of the law of the Lord was consistent with this revelation, as the contents of the BoLoL contains exactly those contents to a certain extent. Quoting from another portion of Alex Smith's article, the BoLoL was the first actual tithing book used by the church, but it wasn't a normal accounting book the way that we'd expect kind of like a donation ledger to read. Quote, "In addition to reflecting general worthiness, donations made for temple construction were seen more literally as denoting ownership in the temple. For instance, in a message to the saints in Britain, Wilford Woodruff wrote, quote, "I wish the female society in all the branches to continue their subscriptions for the temple until it is finished. Let their money and names be brought together the same as all other tithings and offerings, that when the temple is finished, the whole amount they have paid may stand opposite their names in the book of the law of the Lord, that it may be known who are the owners of the house." Back to Alex Smith. Church leaders' emphasis on recording donations, both for access to the temple once it was completed and as a demonstration of general worthiness, gave members motivation to ensure that their donations were recorded in the book. Apparently responding to complaints that contributions were not being properly recorded, Joseph Smith repeatedly counseled that all donations for the temple's construction be collected by only authorized agents, directed to the trustee, and logged by the temple recorder in the book of the law of the Lord, end quote. So according to Alex Smith and the Joseph Smith Papers calculation, almost 80% of the BoLoL is just listing donations. Some of them are long passages, and some are just names with the amounts. Long passages like we read about John Wilkie and his wife. Others are just, this person gave this amount in cash or in a doorknob or something like that. Now what's really interesting though is the amounts were never totaled. So what the donation list actually amounts to is more of a guest list, not an actual accounting of how much has been donated to the temple construction. And this is noted by Alex Smith when he discusses the utility of the BoLoL. Quote, "It is also the first financial record to combine the element of worthiness with the conception of the tithe. As the donations were initially to be entirely for the construction of the temple, it appears that Joseph Smith viewed the book of the law of the Lord as a literal fulfillment of the instruction to keep a book of the law of God, a general church record of all those who consecrate properties. Expanding on the revelatory language in the letter to Phelps that church members, quote, whose name are not found written in the book of the law, in that day shall not find an inheritance among the saints of the Most High. Smith introduced the principle that a physical record of worthiness, as demonstrated by the payment of tithes on the pages of the book of the law of the Lord, was a requirement of eligibility for the blessings of the temple, end quote. Basically, you donate to the temple, you get access to the temple. The BoLoL is where your donation is recorded and bound within this book. What is bound on earth by the Lord's anointed is bound in heaven. Now, it's also very interesting to note that donations were returned to some people, usually women whose husbands were serving missions or had recently died or were neglectful or abusive. Once again, from Alex Smith's article, and we're going to discuss the meta of this article in part 3. So just bear with me as we continue to read through it. The whole article is wonderfully fascinating. There are a couple of pictures of exhibits with the article itself that really add a lot of important context to this. But another passage, quote, "For instance, while Apostle Orson Hyde was on a mission departed from Nauvoo on April 15, 1840, his wife, Marinda Johnson Hyde, on January 29, 1842, quote, presented her offering for the temple, a tablecloth value $5, which was accepted and returned to her again for her benefit, she having to support herself and 2 little children by her industry while her husband is absent, and this offering shall be her memorial to all generations, wherever the knowledge of the building of the temple of the Lord in the city of Nauvoo shall come." End quote. Back to Smith. Nor is this the only example in the book of the law of the Lord of donations being accepted, recorded, and returned for the donor's use. 2 days after Miranda's offering, on January 31st, 1842, Agnes Moulton Coolbrith Smith, the widow of Joseph Smith's brother Don Carlos, quote, presented her offering 4 large and 12 smaller glass curtain knobs, value $8, and 1 fur for a coat collar, $2, which was accepted and returned to her benefit and her 3 little daughters. And may the blessings of Abraham be sealed upon them forever through the new and everlasting covenant and the priesthood of the Son of God. Amen. A few buzzwords in there we're going to discuss in just a second, but back to Alex Smith's article. A few days earlier, on January 18th, 1842, Willard Richards records that another donor, quote, offered a silver watch purchased and saved by her own labor, as she stated to the recorder, besides supporting her children, her husband having neglected his family the past year. Contrary to the principles of righteousness, her offering was accepted and returned to her again for the purpose of assisting her to provide for her children and the privileges of the font given her and her children. And may the blessings of Abraham's God rest upon her forever and ever. Amen. End quote. Now, this is super notable in that the Nauvoo leadership recognized the value of the widow's mite and how hard it was for families to get along who still chose to donate when times were tough, or when they were widowed, or when their husband was off on a mission, or when their husband was neglected and abusive. They were compassionate enough to return the donations and still record those people as having made the contribution and entering their name into the book of the law of the Lord. Whether those widows or abandoned wives gave something in return to have their donation recorded is a matter of question. And it's entirely possible because 2 of the women that Alex Smith listed in his paper had become Joseph's wives when these donations were given and were returned to them, and their names were still recorded in the book of the law of the Lord. When we see somebody being blessed with the blessings of Abraham sealed upon them through the new and everlasting covenant and the priesthood of the Son of God, may the blessings of Abraham's God rest upon her forever and ever. Amen. Those are buzzwords for polygamy. So what I'm saying is, some of the donations in the book of the law of the Lord could possibly be alluding to donations that were given to the recorder of the temple, to Joseph Smith, that he returned after he got something back from these women. Okay? That's what I'm saying. I don't know how else to say it. I don't know how else to say it. It could be interpreted that some of the lines within the book of the law of the Lord are a prostitution ledger. If I wasn't being clear. Let's move on. Let's move on from this. So that all relates to the purpose of the donation portion of the book of the law of the Lord. We're talking about the purpose of the BoLoL, right? So a person gives money, then they get into the temple. Or they give something else and their name gets recorded in the donation book and they get into the temple anyway. But what about the other parts of the BoLoL? What about the other content of it? The Joseph Smith Journal for 1842 and the 9 revelations at the beginning. What is the purpose of having those in this BoLoL? Well, Alex Smith had this to say about the revelations in the article, which, of course, once again, you're going to find in the show notes. Quote, "There is no apparent intrinsic relationship among the 9 revelations," end quote. In response, all I have to say is, what? Are you serious? How can the relationship connecting these revelations not be apparent? I mean, we discussed the content and context of all 9 of those revelations in part 1 of this episode, the content of the BoLoL. They're clearly Joe's hits of theocracy building. They are the most important revelations they're included for the implicit reasoning of running a theocratic empire, right? Anybody who reads those 9 revelations together clearly isn't seeing what I'm seeing, because the whole damn book is titled the Book of the Law of the Lord. It was the book established to be the code of law of the Lord, to replace or to supersede the law of the land. Each revelation works with the previous and with the next revelation to form a system of governance of the church, which could be mapped to a larger system of governance, like, say, the entire United States. Now, this is how I see the plan, and I'm open to corrections or different ways of looking at this issue, but this is how I see the plan in light of everything that was Nauvoo. Nauvoo was established as the headquarters of the church, right? The resolution would be passed declaring it as a sovereign territory within the boundaries of the United States. The Council of 50 was created to be Joe's parliament, and he the theocratic monarch. The Council of 50 Minutes contained the proceedings of those internal meetings, and those were never meant to be public, but the Book of the Law of the Lord was. It was meant to be public, and it was essentially, it seems like with those 9 revelations, it essentially forms the constitution of the Mormon theocracy based on the laws of the Lord, meaning these revelations given through his prophet. The list of the names of the people who gave time or goods or talents to the construction of the temple, those would be the elite list of founding members, the founding fathers and mothers of the Mormon theocracy headquartered at Nauvoo. Now, this idea that the book of the law of the Lord was to be the Constitution of America after the Mormon Revolution. This idea is perfectly captured during the Schism crisis, when bloody Brigham Young was grabbing power left and right and shouldering his way into the presidency of the church. In 1845, less than a year after Joseph Smith's death, Brigham Young commissioned a portrait to be painted by Selah Van Sickle, in which he's standing next to a table with a Bible and a Book of Mormon sitting on it. In his hand is a little book in this portrait with Law of the Lord painted on the binding. Look at Alex Smith's article. You can see a picture of that portrait itself. This book, the Book of the Law of the Lord, was supposed to be the foundation of the American Mormon theocracy. That was the true purpose. That is why, that's the reason for the compilation of these seemingly disparate revelations at the beginning, and of course Joe's journal, and for the donations. When taken all together, it reveals how crucial and how integral and important this book was supposed to be during and for and to facilitate the Mormon Revolution. This also exhibits something that I neglected to mention in last week's episode. Joe's journals were initially written with a tacit understanding that one day they'd be public. The BoLoL included his first successful attempt at actually keeping a regular journal. His 1842 journal, because it's kind of peppered through the pages of the BoLoL with donations kind of breaking it up. But his subsequent Nauvoo journals were included in 4 separate little notebooks, and that represents his daily walk in Nauvoo. Understandably, his journals are relatively reliable, but they are far from complete when it comes to his actual conduct in Nauvoo, which is why historians are forced to other journals by Wilford Woodruff, William Clayton, Eliza R. Snow, and a small handful of others to illustrate what was actually going on. Now, let me reiterate this and be perfectly clear, because just like Andrew Torres, I like being clear. Joe's Nauvoo journals were initially written so he could present himself in a good light to the public once those journals were made public at some point later in his life. His multiple times telling people in his journals, telling people to stop practicing polygamy, his multiple denials of the practice, his smearing of the John C. Reckitt Bennett for practicing quote-unquote spiritual wifery, contained throughout dozens of passages in his Nauvoo journals. That was all recorded with the understanding that those journals would one day be read by the public. Now, when a person writes a journal, it's usually understood that they do so with the intent of writing their experiences and their internal thoughts about those experiences in a place that will be private during their life and hopefully not public after their death. Joe, on the other hand, wrote his Nauvoo journals as a PR stunt that he could use in the future to clear his name of accusations or to provide an alibi or something. Now, Joe died before those journals could be properly utilized, but how they were best used was by Whiteout Willard Richards and George A. Smith in compiling the history of the church in the 1850s that was later published by B.H. Roberts under Joseph F. Smith's presidency at the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries. Joe's journals are a crucial piece to Nauvoo history, but they're obviously slanted and written in such a way as to make him a demigod who opposed polygamy. All of this leads us perfectly into the third and final portion of our episode today, talking about the book of the law of the Lord, the controversy. Part 1 established the content and the context. Part 2 described the purpose, as I see the purpose for the BoLoL initially, even if others, like historians who work for the Joseph Smith Papers Project, are unable to draw the overarching conclusions that I have seen. Now, Part 3, we get to discuss the impact and suppression of this book, the controversy, because obviously this thing was withheld in the First Presidency vault and hidden from the public until very, very recently. Historians have known about the BoLoL for well over a century. B.H. Roberts, the greatest historian the church has ever had, likely saw the book of the law of the Lord personally, and possibly just when he was putting the finishing touches on Volume 4 of the History of the Church, and he needed Joe's 1842 journal to do so. He may have had restricted access to just the journal portion of it under the watchful eye of Joseph F. Smith. Maybe he had full access to it. I don't really know. I don't know if there's any information to corroborate what level of access B.H. Roberts had to the Book of the Law of the Lord. But the BoLoL was initially in the First Presidency's archive, which the First Presidency's archive is a bank vault-sized safe of the most valuable and controversial documents and artifacts of Mormon history. However, due to the perceived sensitivity of the BoLoL, Joseph F. Smith chose to keep it in his personal archive. Now, Joseph F. Smith's personal archive, instead of being a bank vault-sized safe, was a very small safe that could be loaded onto a hand dolly and moved around at a moment's notice. This personal safe retained the absolute most sensitive and damaging documents in Mormon history, like the Council of 50 Minutes, the William Clayton journals, the Joseph Smith 1832 First Vision account, and a small handful of other documents, some of which have been released to the public. Only a very small number of men have actually been able to see the BoLoL, let alone open it and study it and take transcripts from it. The first indication that we have of a historian having access to even see the BoLoL after B.H. Roberts comes from the diaries of Leonard J. Arrington. Arrington was the official church historian from 1972 to 1982 when the office was essentially retired. His diaries were recently published by Signature Books in 3 books totaling over 2,700 pages. In his journals, he refers to the BoLoL just a very few couple of times, and he peripherally chronicles its journey through the archives by who was able to see it at various times. The first time that Arrington references the Book of the Law of the Lord is in July of 1972, when he was barely 6 months into being the church's official historian. That day, he went to lunch with Homer Durham, and this is what he remembered of their conversation. Quote, "He told me about some of his experiences working for the historical department in the 1940s. He was doing research for the Gospel Kingdom, containing excerpts from the sermons and writings of John Taylor and for other books and articles. He said this was in the early 1940s. He said the staff of church historian's office allowed him pretty much free rein. Alvin Smith on occasion showed him material in the safe, and he remembers seeing there the original copy of the Revelation which called Heber J. Grant and George Teasdale to be members of the Quorum of the 12. He also saw there some letters of Joseph Smith, the Far West Missouri record, and the Book of the Law of the Lord. He does not remember seeing there the diaries of John Taylor." End quote. The existence of the Book of the Law of the Lord was known of, but even the official church historian didn't have unfettered access to it. G. Homer Durham somehow was shown the content of the First Presidency's vault by Alvin Smith in the early 1940s, but by the time the early 1970s rolled around, those vaults had been buttoned up much tighter. Another passage in Arrington's diary the following month, this is August of 1972, perfectly illustrates the mentality of the church presidency with respect to the archives and how hard the job of church historian really was. Arrington was in a meeting with President N. Eldon Tanner and the prophet at the time, Harold B. Lee, discussing the archives and the project of New Mormon history. And this is what Arrington remembers of the conversation. Quote, President Lee then said with respect to one of the items, making available the source materials in the vault of the First Presidency and in President Smith's safe. Now quoting Lee, quote, I'm not sure how far we can go on this without investigating it more completely. There are some things that have been kept in our vault for more than 100 years, and perhaps they should always remain there. For example, the seer stone and the law of the Lord. I don't even know what that is. And there are some other artifacts in that same category. I said, now quoting Arrington, of course, we are not interested in those items. They ought to remain in the vault of the First Presidency. We are thinking in terms of diaries and journals, minutes, and other such records that are necessary in history writing. President Lee then said, quote, the history or possession of many of these things goes back many years before I ever became a member of the First Presidency. Brother Joseph Anderson was given care and keeping of many things, and we'll have to discuss it with him to see reasons why these things were kept in our vault. We agree with you that it needs investigation and thought we will give it consideration and be in touch with you later. Now, Arrington thinks about this in his response to it. I said, the main thing is that whatever we may have access to, that we be given access to these things as soon as possible so that we can use them in writing our history. Brother Lee seemed to nod his head in the affirmative to this suggestion. End quote. Now this was recorded in Arrington's journal contemporary with the events in August of 1972. But a wild card factor that was only beginning to influence the scene of Mormonism in the early 1970s, which nobody could account for, was beginning to enter the scene. Boyd K. Packer. Leonard Arrington, along with a few other scholars, including Richard Bushman, conceived of an idea to create a narrative of early Mormon history that accounted for and dealt with controversial issues in Mormon history. Packer, being very well read in the subject of Mormon history, didn't like the idea of New Mormon history. And Packer was capable of shutting down New Mormon history and pushed to have the office of official church historian retired. Arrington and Packer constantly butted heads. Now, Harold B. Lee was in his early 70s when he had this conversation with Leonard Arrington about the seer stones and about the Book of the Law of the Lord and publishing about these artifacts. However, Harold B. Lee died just a year later in December of 1973. Spencer W. Kimball took over, and the trifecta of evil, Benson, Packer, and Peterson, were on Kimball's shoulder as the church was coming under attack for racial issues and for controversial Mormon history. And this is in the era of dialogue and of Sunstone and of Mormon History Association and all these secular academic institutions, the founding of all of these. Boyd K. Packer successfully lobbied Kimball to shut down New Mormon history and further suppress documents like the Council of 50 Minutes, the Book of the Law of the Lord, the Clayton Diaries, the seer stones themselves, and dozens of other documents and artifacts that researchers were asking for and publishing about in the secular academic fora. In 1981, Boyd K. Packer attacked church historians in his talk titled "The Mantle is Far, Far Greater Than the Intellect." In that talk, in no uncertain terms, he said, quote, there is a temptation for the writer or teacher of church history to want to tell everything, whether it is worthy or faith-promoting or not. Some things that are true are not very useful, end quote. Packer railed repeatedly against academics from top to bottom of this talk, and it was so controversial that the talk itself was initially suppressed, only to be quietly published in a BYU Studies article a few months later after there was enough pushback. If you want to learn more about this and about Boyd K. Packer in general, go listen to Whack Pack Attack. That's episode 33 of the Glassbox podcast with Joe Geisner. Needless to say, Boyd K. Packer decried Mormon history academia. He issued a statement against those wishing to attend Sunstone Symposia, and his all-out war against historians was in full swing by the early 1980s as this idea of New Mormon history was being conceived. There was a major issue, though, when it came to the Book of the Law of the Lord. The Church History Department wanted to publish the Joseph Smith journals, the Nauvoo era books, right? But his journal begins in December 1841 in the Book of the Law of the Lord. So if the church was going to publish Joe's journals, they'd have to publish the 1842 portion included in the Book of the Law of the Lord. The only problem was that publishing just one portion of an artifact with many other important entries in its pages, let's just say that leaves a lot to be desired, and it looks like suppression of everything else that the BoLoL contained. Well, that's what it was, right? It was suppression, but still, the optics of it looked bad. So I'm going to quote again from Alex Smith's article about the BoLoL from 2012. Quote, "For today's researchers, the journal entries in the Book of the Law of the Lord are frequently the most primary sources for descriptions of Joseph Smith's daily activities during 1842. Certain details about key events, e.g., the organization of the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo, John C. Bennett's expulsion from the church, the second attempt to extradite Joseph Smith to Missouri, the creation of the Nauvoo Masonic Lodge, and the construction of the temple and Nauvoo House, are found only in this book. Some of the earliest extant drafts of a few of Joseph Smith's revelations are found here. It is the church's first tithing book, and its record of financial donations are a rich cultural history resource, providing valuations of common goods and services." End quote. Publishing this crucial source of Joe's Nauvoo journal while suppressing the remainder of the artifact, that was an abrasive concept to Arrington and to many other church historians. However, they attempted to do just that, publish just the 1842 journal, and Arrington's diary recounts when he received word that the diaries of Joseph Smith would be published, including his 1842 journal extracted from the pages of the Book of the Law of the Lord. Quote, "December 18th, 1986, Thursday. Ron Esplin telephoned today to say that Elder Dallin Oaks had telephoned him to say that the First Presidency had today approved the proposal he had presented to allow us, the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute, to publish the diaries of Joseph Smith. This includes the diaries of Willard Richards and the portion of his diary in the First Presidency vault in the Law of the Lord book. Elders Boyd K. Packer and Oaks to be a liaison with us to forward the project. Deseret Book to be publisher, to be delivered to them in 1987. Dean Jesse to be the editor." End quote. So, yes, the Nauvoo Joseph Smith journals would be published under the watchful eye of Boyd K. Packer and Dallin H. Oaks, while the remainder of the Book of the Law of the Lord would remain suppressed. Even just publishing the 1842 journal entries was music to the ears of Arrington, Esplin, and many other historians who had been asking for Joe's Nauvoo journals to be released to the public for decades. Arrington continues, quote, "Ron was almost ecstatic and said he was confident Vice President Jay Balliff of BYU would be equally so. This is the first time the First Presidency have given us the go-ahead on anything since Elder Packer attacked the historians for being too negative." End quote. So Dean Jesse was the editor who published the Joseph Smith journals, and it was not in 1987, but in 1992 in his book, The Papers of Joseph Smith, Volume 2, Journal 1832-42. So why did Jesse finally get clearance to publish this 1842 Joseph Smith journal? Because there wasn't anything about polygamy in it. Remember, when it was initially recorded, Joe only recorded information he was okay with eventually getting out into the world. Joe had planned on his journals being published at some point, so it was censored from the beginning. He never recorded anything in his 1842 journal about polygamy, and that's what they were trying to hide. In fact, much of it tells a story about him constantly fighting rumors of polygamy. Therefore, Boyd K. Packer and Dallin Oaks determined that the information in Joe's 1842 journal wouldn't actually be damaging to the church, and they gave Arrington and Jesse the green light as long as it was just the journal, not the entire Book of the Law of the Lord. As a result, many people were elated to finally have the Nauvoo journals published and no longer closed to researchers. But Jesse's publication of the 1842 journal was also widely known to just be simply extracts from the Book of the Law of the Lord. Historians knew that the BoLoL in its totality was still being suppressed, and many people greeted Jesse's book with outrage instead of elation, justifiably so. Joe's 1842 journal is super important, but so are the revelations, both published and unpublished, included at the beginning of the BoLoL, and so are all of the tithing contributions that comprise over 80% of the actual book itself. Now, the whole issue was very frustrating for many historians who felt like this wasn't enough. They were still hiding this thing. It felt criminal to only release a small portion of the Book of the Law of the Lord when the remainder of its contents are so incredibly valuable and one of a kind to researchers, and it had been closed for decades, for well over a century. Fast forward to 2012, 20 years of historians howling at the church to release the Book of the Law of the Lord. Finally, an article was published in the Journal of Mormon History written by Alex D. Smith, one of the historians working on the Joseph Smith Papers project, which discussed the provenance, the content, and the importance of the Book of the Law of the Lord. We've read a number of extracts from that very article today. This Alex Smith article was published while the church was still suppressing the Book of the Law of the Lord. Now, when I say suppressing, I mean, I want to make a point here. That word almost sugarcoats what's really going on. They were hiding it. They knew that there was information in it which could be damning from their perspective, so they chose to keep the BoLoL from the harsh light of academic scrutiny by shoving it into a dark corner of their personal vaults and blatantly refusing any researcher requesting access to it for any reason, because the leadership was obviously scared of truth. The BoLoL is one of those truths that aren't very useful, according to Boyd K. Packer. They hid this artifact like they did the Seer Stones, the first vision accounts, the first vision account, I should say, the Council of 50 Minutes, the Clayton Journals, which are still being suppressed. This is just one more thing to add to the list of the stuff that the church has been hiding for decades or over a century, in spite of historians knowing it exists and repeatedly requesting access to it. Finally, in 2014, the Book of the Law of the Lord was published in its entirety on the Joseph Smith Papers website, but with a caveat, because the Joseph Smith Papers had already published Joe's 1842 journal extracted from the pages of the BoLoL. So they published the high-resolution scans of the entire book, but only a transcription of the 9 revelations at the beginning. So if you want to read the 1842 journal entries and the donation records, you have to find the page and read the handwritten note yourself, which is in stark contrast to almost every other document that's uploaded on the Joseph Smith Papers, where the full transcripts are available and indexed for searching, placed on the screen next to the scans of the document. It's also published in print form as well. But the controversy of the Book of the Law of the Lord illustrates how resilient the Mormon Church is and always has been to critical questions and people just seeking information. People have known of this artifact's existence for decades, and it's been silently hidden away in a vault for over a century and a half, completely closed to researchers with only a couple of exceptions. Even the publication of just one part of it, the journals, was tightly controlled by the apostles. The remainder of the book being hidden away for 2 decades after that journal portion was published has successfully hindered the advancement of Mormon history academia, because maintaining a false narrative has always been more important than allowing verifiable information to dictate the direction of the institution. Alex Smith's conclusion of his 2012 article is particularly poignant in light of everything we've discussed today. Once again, you'll find a link to it in the show notes. Quote, "The Book of the Law of the Lord and later tithing volumes were a reflection of the prophet's ongoing conception of a book of the law of God. Perhaps the greatest importance of the book lies in its theological implication, a record decreed by revelation to record for heaven and earth the deeds and consecrations of the saints. As a historical record of the early church, the Book of the Law of the Lord is supremely significant." End quote. And I would add to his comments, it's not only important for the theological implications of fulfilling Joseph Smith's record-keeping revelations, but the real importance of the book of the law of the Lord lies in its theocratic implications of fulfilling Joseph Smith's greatest dreams. A complete and total overthrow of society, seating him atop a theocratic throne of Mormon America. For its contribution to contextualizing the mindset of the founding prophet of Mormonism, calling the book of the law of the Lord important does a disservice to the artifact. It's one of the most integral pieces of Nauvoo Mormon history, and the church successfully masked it from the world for longer than any of us have been alive. Any institution this bulletproof to facts, which relies on lying and misrepresenting or obfuscating reality to thrive, is not an institution worthy of adoration. It deserves nothing better than unequivocal condemnation and exposure. In the words of the late and terrible Packer himself, some things that claim truth are not very useful. That's going to do it for our episode today. I want to give a huge thanks to my good friend Joe Geisner for helping to put some of this information into context. I tend to do a bit of disparate collection of information, and I always like having somebody that I can call on to say, hey, what does all of this mean? And Joe really helps me out with this and with many episodes. So just a huge thanks to him. Also, I want to say a huge thanks to our patrons over at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. We do have a few new patrons. Looks like Marty, Rebecca, and Taylor. Thank you to the three of you for pledging to support the show on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. That leaves us at positive $4 an episode from last week. So if you want to join the ranks of the Namo family and gain access to a whole bunch of extra content, you can do so at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Lately, we have been reading through Mormonism Unveiled. Next week, we are going to be reading through the Spalding Affidavits, which rounds out the entire Mormonism Unveiled on audiobook with my commentary. If that's something that interests you, hey, give us $1 a show. I would really appreciate it, and you get a bunch of extra content. And ask any of our patrons, it's worth it. Also, I wanted to just make a small announcement. This is actually more of house cleaning than anything else. I get a lot of messages from people who are going through the backlog, and a lot of people say that they kind of ignore the special edition episodes of the show and that they are here for the history, whereas the special edition episodes from when we started are not really much history. A lot of them are just kind of conversations. So what I'm going to do is essentially remove the special edition episodes, the non-historical timeline episodes from the regular feed, and I'm going to just keep those over on the Patreon-only feed. That way, when you access the Naked Mormonism regular feed, you're just going to see from episode 1 to 191 as you see today, and it's just going to be the serialized breakdown of the history. There are also going to be the clean-cut episodes of like the Book of Mormon and of Mark Hoffman and the Race and the Priesthood. Those CC episodes, because they're history related, are also going to remain in the regular feed that's open and available to everybody. But all of the conversation episodes, all of the special edition episodes from when we initially started, those are all going to just remain only on the Patreon exclusive archive. Because right now we're on episode 191, number 191. This is actually episode number 264. So this is hopefully going to clean up the backlog a little bit, make it a little bit easier to understand when somebody is a new listener to the show and they want to go through a serialized history of Joseph Smith and Mormonism, that it just transitions from one episode to the next, and they aren't forced to kind of skip around. It's more of a house cleaning issue, but I figured I would just let all of you know. If there are particular episodes that you really enjoyed and you really wanted to listen to in the backlog there, of those special edition non-history episodes, then like I said, you can find those all on the Patreon exclusive feed. Also, one more thing, we announced this a couple weeks ago. I wanted to just put a bug back in your ear. I'm going to be giving a presentation for the Utah Psychedelics Society on April 19th, 2020. That's going to be at the Salt Lake City Library. You're going to find information for that event in the show notes or on Psych Events. It's just one E, PSYCHEVENTS.com, or you can search for Utah Psychedelic Society on Meetup and find their events page there. We're going to do a presentation on the entheogenic origins of Mormonism, as well as a walking tour of the Gilgal Gardens, a stone sculpture garden in downtown Salt Lake City, something hiding in plain sight, which is the subtitle of the presentation itself. So if that's something that interests you, check the show notes and consider coming along to the Bicycle Day presentation on psychedelics and early Mormonism, the entheogenic origins of Mormonism. It's going to be really fun. You can also get VIP tickets to attend a special VIP dinner with myself and with the organizers of the event afterwards. So information for everything that I talked about here is in the show notes, and as well as a patron feed, as well as the shop for merch for the show on the glassbox.com, glassboxpodcast.com/shop, where you can pick up shirts, and we'll be integrating more and more merch as time goes forward. But for now, you can get some shirts, unisex, in multiple different sizes of logos of the show, as well as the Joseph Smith Puppet Master shirt. That's all we got for tonight, all the house cleaning and everything. Of course, if you're a patron subscriber, stick around after the show, because we always got the C segment, a little bit of extra content that I just want to throw in there, just a little bit of extra giving back to the people who give to me and support the show. But hey, you know what? All y'all stuck around, and I just want to thank you so much for lending me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the Opening Arguments podcast and the law offices of P. Andrew Torres as legal counsel. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2020, all rights reserved.